Great. Well, thank you for having me be part of this very prestigious panel. I'm going to keep my remarks fairly short because I know that the preceding or the subsequent presentations will go into much more depth. But I really want to cover, as Debbie said, the impacts that the DERs are having on the bulk power system and some of the lessons learned that our notorious SPIDERWG System Planning Impacts of DERs working group has really been working on. And I'll keep it at a fairly high level because I really want to kind of tell a story rather than just highlight all the fantastic work that stakeholder group has done. I want to use it to tell a story around what that group is seeing. So our NERC technical committees, which are stakeholder driven, SPIDERWG is a technical subgroup under our Reliability and Security Technical Committee. And so it consists of industry stakeholders, industry experts that have a vested interest in ensuring bulk system reliability under increasing levels of distributed energy resources. So the first question, when we pitched this group and we stood this group up a couple of years ago, the first question immediately was, well, what does NERC have to do with DERs? They're not within NERC's jurisdiction. So why are we focused on that? I should say I don't work in compliance. I don't work in enforcement. I always say I'm the good guy that you want to talk to before those bad guys show up that I don't talk to within our organization. But our goal is to really help in a positive way move the needle on reliability. So to answer that initial question, the pitch was made and well received that at some point DERs will have an aggregate impact on the bulk power system. And we're already seeing that all over the world. And I'll show some examples. It's not just in one area or certain pockets as we see more and more distributed energy resources, particularly solar systems, whether that's utility scale solar. I'm talking about 5, 10, 15 megawatt unit connected at say a 34 kV bus, or it could be hundreds of thousands or millions of rooftop systems all over the place behind the meter. Those both have an aggregate impact on the bulk power system and obviously on the distribution system as well. So there's a vested interest, and we need the whole electrical ecosystem to work together to really accomplish something from a reliability standpoint. So this is a chart. What I've done in the presentation is I've tried to boil up the key point I'm trying to get across into 1 or 2 sentences. Some of those turned into 5 or 6 bullets. Unfortunately, you kind of can't help yourself, but I try to keep the messages really short and to a high level. I know I always crave that from a presentation. So hopefully that's helpful to you all, and I'll kind of walk through with some visuals as much as possible. So this was pulled from our NERC long-term reliability assessment, our LTRA, just showing the NERC-wide cumulative distributed solar PV capacity as one of the emerging reliability challenges. I won't even call it a risk, but a challenge that we'll be facing moving forward. And this only goes out to 2029, but you notice that that's just a fairly steady and consistent rapid growth, I'll say, and I use a lot of adjectives there, but going from 20,000 megawatts to 45,000 plus megawatts in any amount of time is quite a bit. But going over a 10-year period, that's a lot. We were seeing some amount of load growth, but the fact that a lot of that is being accounted for by distributed resources makes that net load either flat or in many cases negative, which I'll show here in a bit. So the main message here is that DER penetrations are growing. It's mostly solar PV at the moment, but we expect batteries to follow, and with that possibly hybrid plants for small scale distributed resources, and the idea of possible hybrid resources where you take a battery energy storage device and you put it with a small solar plant or even maybe a small wind plant or something like that. And that now we have a hybrid resource, and in many cases that can play into markets, and I'll talk briefly about that, but I know folks on the later presentations who are experts of the experts within the markets realm will cover that. So this is, to put it into context, this is the California Energy Commission's behind the meter PV projection going out to 2030. And I always look at it from the lens of a planner, a grid planner who's worried about 10 years out from now, right? They have the responsibility of planning for a future grid. Now, the real-time operations, especially these days, is a huge challenge where we have rolling outages, wildfires, hurricanes, cold snaps, all kinds of kind of bad things happening in the midst of a pandemic on top of that. and then that's of utmost importance from a real-time reliability and safety perspective. I often live in that planning realm of we need to be prepared for the future, and we need to be more proactive about being prepared for the future. And so I'm always thinking about that 10-year out base case, because reliability decisions that are being made today will affect that future grid condition. A FERC colleague of mine always used to say, plan it like you operate it like you plan it. Back at that time, gosh, that phrase frustrated me, being someone that had worked in the industry for quite a while, because it's not that easy. But fundamentally, gosh, it is that easy, because if you didn't plan it like you operated it, it's very hard to operate it when you get there in real time. So when I look at the projections from, say, 2010 out to 2020, even, we went from a very small amount to a very high amount very quickly. And then you look from 2020 out to 2030, and it's just getting higher and higher. So DER penetrations are growing very quickly and very steadily. And this is, again, in the California region in particular. We have to put that into context, as Debbie mentioned, around the overall system, the bulk power system as well. What I showed was just behind the meter stuff, right? We haven't even talked about a physical power plant that is observed and monitored by the grid operator. We're at 25,000 megawatts out in 2030 of stuff that the grid operator can't see. That's a challenge. So then you look at this plot. It's a summary chart from the CAISO website. And you see that 92.52% that's highlighted there in blue. I think in the instantaneous, that's a 5-minute measurement, but in the instantaneous, I think it got up to 95%, if I remember correctly. That's 95% renewables, so wind, solar, and I think they include a couple of other things in there too. Penetration level on the bulk power system, coupled with a whole lot of distributed resources that we can't see on the distribution system. And wow, that's a complicated place to be. And I remember 5 years ago, I continue to say this message, but 5 years ago, I was laughed out of the room at a planning committee meeting at the NERC level, right, and rightfully so. I was talking about 100% penetration levels, and man, was I the crazy one in the room for thinking such. And I guess now it's a badge of pride to say, well, here we are in many areas of the world, and I think many areas to come, we'll see this more and more, and probably more quickly. So the BPS is dealing with its own challenges, regardless of the DER penetrations, and the DER penetrations sort of compound on that. And I'm not trying to paint a bleak picture here. There are things we can do about this, but we need to be very proactive in doing stuff about this stuff. Using a lot of stuffs, but hopefully you get the point. I then look at this chart and I say, okay, 95%, 92% penetration level. Well, what is that, right? That's not a peak load condition. That's an off-peak condition where load is low, renewables are high, and DERs are going to be high, because there's a coincidence of say, for example, solar on the bulk system and solar on the DERs in the California region, right? So we then, you go on the CAISO website and you pull up their net load value. So net load being gross load minus other resources. And I think they have a funky calculation where they possibly include renewables in that as well. And I just start looking at this quantity here, and I go, you can look at this without doing any statistical analysis, seeing that number is trending towards zero. And what happens when that number hits zero? When your net load on your system is zero, and it's entirely provided by behind the meter type stuff that you can't see, and variable resources. And now maybe we won't, maybe we will get there, but maybe we won't. Maybe we will have to keep some amount of synchronous online for grid stability type stuff, which maybe I'll highlight very briefly. Those are key reliability considerations, but just here, I mean, we're seeing that net load quantity dropping in a big chunk of that at DER. So lowest demand levels during off-peak conditions coincident with renewables. And I sort of ask myself, will the multi-sector electrification that we hear about and we are seeing already, will that outpace the installation of DERs or not? Because to me, will that go flat, or will it go back up, or will it drive down below zero, is sort of dependent on, well, how many electric vehicles will we get, and will we go to electric heating, and all of these other considerations that will maybe drive end-use electric load up quite a bit in the coming years as we try to go to a greener world with less greenhouse gases and things like that. So that's a question that looms out there for me. Of if I had those charts, I'd love to overlay them on top of each other for projections out into the future. But regardless, the things that are being put on the system now are inverter-based technology, renewables, wind, solar, batteries, hybrid plants, and other types of renewables, much more so. And when you look at the interconnection queues, that's about all you see. And so again, but from a DER perspective, DER in some regions is a big chunk of that. So I start with California because 5 years ago, folks said, well, this is a California issue. It's not my problem. I just had a conversation with someone who said, yes, many regions around the world, around the country today still think it's just a California issue and it's not an issue for their footprint. And so be it. Maybe you're in an area where DER penetrations are very low. But we saw from those charts, the CAISO charts a moment ago, that can take off very, very quickly, particularly as policies change. So let's jump to the other end in the New England footprint, right? Where, gosh, you're so far north, you'd never see a solar plant ever, right? Well, no, right? And we know that already. So it's not just a California issue. And I love this chart. It's one of my favorite charts. It shows the yearly forecast going back to 2014 of ISO New England, looking at their PV nameplate capacity. And most of the solar PV in their footprint is DERs, utility scale DERs, and many within certain regions of the ISO New England footprint. But you see that 2014 forecast, 2015 above it, 16, 17, 18, 19, up to 20. And then that dark solid line is the actual. And you can see it goes up to 2020 with dots of the actuals. And then it, again, projects it out into the future. And what the key takeaway here is, your forecast is definitely wrong. They always are. Your forecast is always off by something. And the goal is to make it off by as little as possible. So we can get that out of the way. The forecast is always wrong. It's always a matter of how wrong is it. And hopefully it's wrong within a margin of error that we're good with and we're safe with, which is why we have things like reserve margins. The thing that catches me on this is that they were underestimating the penetration every single year. And in the short-term horizon, it wasn't a bad misestimate, right? It wasn't a poor estimate looking out 1 year or maybe 2 years. It's when you try to project the 2014 out to 2023 or 2024, where you see, I was way off. And then I go to the next year and I'm way off. And I go to the next year and I'm way off. And that margin's getting smaller. And so that's a positive out of this. It's not a negative. Their forecasts are getting a lot better, which is good. It's just that it's been underestimated every single year, which to me just further emphasizes that the stuff is coming very quickly because of policies that are in place, as well as economics. And so it's just to me, I look at this as an impact, right? The DERs are shifting the peak load hour, and we're so used to studying peak load that when you look in the NERC reliability standards, it doesn't differentiate what peak we're talking about. Are we talking about the gross load peak, or are we talking about the net load peak where we consider DERs? Or is it the net load peak of the bulk power system perspective? It's unclear in the reliability standards that are approved today. And SPIDERWG is fighting an uphill battle to try to get that clarified, so grid planners are all studying in fair uniformity the same type of thing. Those assumptions that go into those studies affect the models that we use and the study assumptions that we apply in those models. And the most important thing I think here is that information sharing is of critical importance, and having that information available is important. But you can see those blue dots that really sell the message, right? So if you look at say the present, the dark line is the load forecast, you see that blue dot is around hour 15. And you say, okay, there's my peak hour, I'm gonna go study. And now they start piling on solar PV resources, behind the meter solar PV resources, which have that bell-shaped curve that when the sun comes up, it provides output and then it goes down in the evening. And that's why you see that shift in one direction based on that irradiance value that's behind that output of the behind the meter solar. And you see 1 megawatt to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 up to 8, and that hour is shifting from hour 15 out to hour 19, right? So as a grid planner, looking out some amount into the future, 5 years, whatever that might be, 10 years, I should no longer be studying maybe my hour 15, because from the grid perspective, my hour 15 is only providing me system load of maybe about 23 gigawatts. But my hour 19 is up at 25.5 gigawatts, right? So if I didn't understand the impacts that behind the meter DER are having on my system, I might be underestimating my peak load capacity by many, many gigawatts, which leads us to possible shortages in energy, which we've seen where we get caught with that ramp and we aren't prepared. We don't have enough flexible resources, and we get caught, and we have to have planned outages, planned load sheds to make sure the system doesn't collapse. So we have a lot to learn from fairly recent experience in that regard. So that to me is another very, very clear indicator of impact. And again, this is 0 to 8 gigawatts. And I go back to this plot, and you can see those projections here of nameplate capacity. They're at what, 4 to 5 gigawatts presently. And let's project that out into a 10-year out base case that has to be studied today by a grid planner. And we're off the chart somewhere out here. And that's, you know, possibly 10 gigawatts. So something to think about. No hard numbers there. Don't quote me on any of that, but it helps hopefully explain what grid planners are having to face from the bulk system perspective with a bunch of DERs within their system. So we've been studying really bulk systems events where unexpectedly, particularly in California, we've seen a lot of solar PV resources trip offline when we have a bulk system fault. And this goes all the way back to the notorious Blue Cut fire, where we spun up a NERC group, and that really initiated a lot of the NERC work on inverters and in a lot of ways the changing resource mix, particularly around the changing technologies associated with that resource mix. And so more recently, well, not even that recently, but February or October 2017 up until fairly recently, we've seen a number of events where DERs are being identified as being involved in these events. So we have a normally cleared fault on the bulk power system. Tree hits a line, whatever it might be, conductor falls and hits other conductors, and we have a fault event as expected, and the transmission level relays operate as designed, and the fault is cleared very quickly, 2 to 3 cycles. And with that, we see 1,000 megawatts of bulk system connected solar drop off, disappear, or cease their injection of power into the grid, which is not to be expected. And more recently, we've been seeing fairly consistent distributed energy resources disappearing. And what that is we see a net load spike, right? So net load actually goes up because the power that's being provided by the DERs on the distribution system is no longer there. And so there's more load there at the interface. And so we actually see a jump up. And that jump up lasts for 5 to 7 minutes and comes right back down. And that's a IEEE 1547-2003 or 14. Jose knows best, but whatever the older version of 1547 is, that's an artifact of that standard. It's a disappear when the grid hiccups and come back 5 to 7 minutes later with pre-configured settings inside of it. I think the new 1547 does a lot better in that regard, and I'll talk more about that here shortly. But the main message here is that DERs are being experienced, we're seeing their impacts on the bulk power system when we have normal bulk power system events now. And that's again, I won't be alarmist and say it's concerning, but it is noticeable for sure. The UK disturbance, this is pulled right out of the Ofgem report from the August 2019 outage that they had, that we saw was all over the news and called a blackout, right? Really, it wasn't a blackout. It was appropriate operation of under frequency load shedding. And unfortunately, they tripped some critical loads that they probably shouldn't have. But UFLS saved the system from going black. What was abnormal was what happened to cause that frequency to fall far enough to trigger load shedding events. And pulled right out of the report, it says our lower bound for total estimated distributed generation lost across the event is 1,300 megawatts, and the loss could be as high as 1,500 megawatts. That's a nuclear power plant sized outage across a very geographically dispersed area, right? So if that's not impactful, I don't know what is. But that was one of multiple contributors. There was a gas plant that tripped off. There was a big bulk system connected wind plant that unexpectedly tripped off. All of these things contributed to DERs disappearing as well. All of those things combined for contributors to the load getting shed. And really those tripping were caused by frequency falling, and then frequency falling so fast that it triggered certain protection schemes within those DERs. They also mentioned our findings on the causes of the distributed generation losses are also highlight the importance of compliance with the distribution code and the need to strengthen and clarify the regulatory framework for these generators to meet current and future electricity system needs. So what they're saying there is we had a grid code in place and the resources were installed and they didn't even meet that grid code. And so they said they did, and they were certified to meet that grid code because in the UK and most other parts of the world, they have stringent grid codes that must be met prior to interconnection. They didn't meet the grid code. And we've seen that in Southern Australia as well. Devices being implemented that are certified to not perform abnormally, and then you go test them in a laboratory environment and you look at them during grid events and you notice, wow, they're disappearing. They're doing strange things. Why is this? Right. And so we have work to do simply to improve those requirements, those equipment capabilities, and then to leverage those equipment capabilities. We published this guideline.
And Brian, you've got 5 more minutes.
Okay, I have 2 slides, I think. We published this reliability guideline in coordination with NERC, actually, and I think it sums up the message really clearly. Implement 1547-2018. It's of paramount importance, and that requires really the state regulatory body or whoever the authority governing interconnection agreements requirements is to go and implement that. But from a bulk power perspective, there's a lot of things that need to be considered, and that guideline covers it in quite a bit of depth, but it's supported by the bulk power system folks. We have models. The bulk system planners perform studies, as I mentioned. We need to model these things in aggregate, and that doesn't mean we need to have everything modeled in great detail, but we do have models that can do this in aggregate. We can aggregate up the DERs and represent them in an aggregate form, but we need some information to populate that model. So we published this guideline after that late last year around planners will need information to populate those models. They can't do it on a whim. They need to know what's out there on the system and what's projected out into the future. And so they need aggregate capacity, aggregate location information. Again, they don't need specific location information or any identifiable information. They need to know the vintage of installation on a ballpark basis so they can make estimates around, will these things trip off? How will they perform? And then they can run sensitivities to see if there's any issue. But all of this requires data flow from the distribution to the transmission entities in an aggregate fashion. So from a requirements perspective, I created this slide kind of on the fly. But I see it as, up at the bulk system level, we have the NERC reliability standards, the FERC, SGIP, LGIP process. System and market operators have their requirements that are imposed on the transmission owners and the distribution entities that are involved. There's data and monitoring requirements that the transmission owners may establish, and they have their facility interconnection requirements that they put in place. And then you have the distribution level regulations as well, probably on actually both the transmission and the distribution entities. There's the state regulations. But what's really important there is the distribution interconnection requirements, which would be applicable down to the individual DER owners. So then we turn that data flow backwards, and now, rather than requirements flow, we talk about data flow, right? So when a resource interconnects to the distribution system, you gather information, the in-service date, the end of service date, the DER type, the DER kilowatt capacity, the vintage of 1547 that was installed, which you could probably estimate from the in-service date. The distribution provider can aggregate that information and provide it up to the grid planners, the ISO RTO, the balancing authority, showing installed capacity at the T to D transformers, the transmission distribution transformers. Aggregate vintage information is needed. There's requirements that are driving certain performance, possibly, particularly in the market environment. There's that T to D measurement point that can be useful for real-time operations and things like that. And then there's maybe utility scale DER measurements. So if I've got a market-based resource that's playing into a market, then maybe they may have some additional requirements on them in terms of monitoring and capabilities. So in terms of considerations for DER, is the flow of DER information clear for your jurisdiction? Is there effective T to D coordination happening that facilitates all this information sharing? That's of critical importance these days. Leverage the guidelines and the guidance that's been provided by industry on integration, success stories, modeling studies, all this stuff. And then look at the planning considerations. I need modeling information in an aggregate capacity. I need to develop my base case assumptions so I can study these penetration levels out into the future, and I can run sensitivities around that. And then I'll need to, as a grid planner, I'll need to data share across regional bodies. So it's not just within a silo. We can't look at California's penetration without considering Arizona and all the other neighbors that have a whole lot of these types of resources as well. So data sharing in that regard will be critically important. And then there's this whole concept that I don't have time to get into, and I believe somebody will, around, are we prepared for the implications of the third-party DER aggregator now? So now I take a whole lot of resources across a wide area and aggregate them up to some third-party entity that's going to be participating in a market. And again, things just got a whole lot more complicated in terms of data sharing, information sharing, and making sure everything works as expected, both in the planning realm and in the operations realm. So I think that's all I had, and happy to take any questions.
Oh, thanks so much, Ryan. That was a great overview of different aspects of impacts of DERs on the bulk power system. If folks have questions, I'd like to suggest you type them into the chat function here. And I'm not seeing anything just yet. I guess, Ryan, maybe one thing I'd ask you is from your experiences and hearing, what's going on around the world, do you have any, are there places, which are the places that are doing this well? Or do you see anyone doing this really well that, you would hold up as someone who's really getting at the modeling and the forecasting and the data sharing? Is there anyone that's doing a particularly exemplary job that we could learn from?
I think there's a lot of success stories now. So, I don't want to favor any one entity or anything like that. I'll say that to someone else. But but I think there's a lot of entities that have come a very long way very quickly. Right. So I feel like a few years ago, there was only maybe a handful where you could point on your fingers and say, wow, they've really got a decent handle on this. And I feel like today it's a much better environment, at least here in North America. I think we do have a tremendous amount to learn from the Australians. Every time we get a presentation from, say, Jenny, she's kind of touting that, we've dealt with this. We've had outages, and gosh, please get prepared right now because you don't want to deal with what we're dealing with. Please. It's like a plead for the rest of the world to get a handle on it because they didn't. I think Hawaii as well is facing, because most of their stuff is DER in some capacity. They don't have a large bulk power system like we do. It's an islanded system, as we know. So they have to deal with, more of this intimate, smaller resource challenges. And so they have a lot of good work going on, good study work in particular, looking at, we're getting close to 100%. We've got to make all this stuff work. And a big part of that is the DER stuff involved with that. So there's a lot to learn there. On the ISO front, CAISO has always been out in the front managing. You see this 95%, and you go, wow. ERCOT is starting to see DERs taking off. They didn't have quite the rapid growth that California did, but now they're seeing that. So when you look at the charts, it's like, gosh, ERCOT's the wind area, right? But now they've got the solar on the bulk system, and now they're seeing DERs in their system. So they're now, I think, getting caught up or being proactive about getting caught up. And then ISO New England as well. I think the fact that they have that chart that shows the forecast year over year over year, and they can explain some really critical things from that, it just shows they have a handle on this and they're thinking about it. So I'll just leave it at that.
Sure, thanks. There's a question from Blair Fink. He asks, what's the latest on resilience? And
that's kind of an open-ended question. So maybe maybe you can reach out to me. I'm actually not the person working directly on resilience, so I'm not going to pretend to know something. I'll be ignorant on this question. I know it's something that gets talked about a lot these days, particularly with the recent events. So I'll leave it at that. My contact information is there on the screen, and I can put you in touch with the right folks internally.
All right, and there might be more discussion around this in the breakout rooms as well. Well, thank you very much, Ryan. That was really helpful.